Boldwood presents The Scam, written by Evie Hunter and read by Julie Maisie. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. In St Tropez, in villa overlooking the sea, in hot tub with hotter man. The stars are putting on a display just for us. Need to pinch myself. Is this really happening to me? Kiss, kiss. Skylar Kennedy grinned as she pressed send, imagining the WhatsApp message winging its way through cyberspace and landing in Nancy's inbox with a soft thud. She would be less than human if she didn't pause to envisage the envy on her friend's face, Sky decided, since ordinarily she wasn't the one who got the man. Well, not the fit one anyway. It was cold and wet in the UK right now, which only added to Sky's smug feeling of satisfaction as she soaked up the sunshine during the day and was wined and dined in 5-star luxury at night because things like this simply didn't happen to Sky, and she was supposed to enjoy the attention, wasn't she? Nancy was the girl who had it all: looks, confidence, a figure to die for, and a game plan mapped out for the rest of her life. Sky had always been her bag carrier, overlooked or disregarded as insignificant by the beautiful people drawn to Nancy like moths to the proverbial. Sky hated the limelight, so that situation suited her perfectly. She was out several nights a week, whenever Nancy needed support, which allowed Sky to convince herself that she wasn't being reclusive. She had a social life, of sorts, and lived vicariously on exaggerated tales of Nancy's various romantic conquests. That was more than enough for Sky. Or had been, until Karim came into her life, at which point her lack of enthusiasm for the dating game made sense. She had subconsciously been waiting for that moment, she realised, and was now getting her reward. She and Nancy had been in a club together when they first noticed Karim. Well, it hadn't been just the two of them who'd noticed him walk in with his retinue as though he owned the place. Every female head in the place had turned to stare in open admiration. Later, Sky learned that he did own the place. Well, he had a controlling share in the consortium that had transformed Alexandria into the happening joint that it had rapidly become. His flair and vision were responsible for that, Sky now knew, even though Karim was too modest to make the admission himself. Cliched though it might sound, their eyes had clashed across the crowded room, and Sky had felt her insides lurch. It seemed downright ridiculous to confess, even to Nancy, that she'd felt an instant connection. It was as though she had been marking time, waiting for the moment that would align her stars and make sense of her existence. Oblivious to the turn that Sky's thoughts had taken, it was Nancy who'd had the confidence to approach Karim. Nothing fazed Nancy. Sky still recalled the seductive sway of her hips as she approached his table, secure in the knowledge that she wouldn't be rejected. Karim's gaze had roamed over her generous curves with a provocative half-smile, and had then landed on Sky, who stood rooted to the spot a few paces behind her friend. It was at her that he flashed an uncontrived smile, her whom he'd invited to have a drink with him. Nancy, to her credit, had shrugged off her only failure in living memory and told Sky to have fun. But she hadn't intended her to have this much fun, Sky knew. Nancy had advised against accepting Karim's invitation to spend the weekend in St Tropez, pointing out that Sky barely knew the man and that he could be an axe murderer, or worse. Sky found it hard to imagine anything worse, and tried not to take offence because Nancy clearly thought Karim had an ulterior motive in seeking Sky out. Besides, they'd been dating sporadically for 2 months, the unscheduled nature of their relationship down to the fact that Karim travelled so much. It's not as though he's taking me to some dark and distant land, Sky pointed out impatiently. We're going to the south of France, that's all. You're the one who's always telling me to get out more. Just be careful and make sure you send me regular messages so that I know you're safe. They hugged. Nancy's brief moment of jealousy, if that's what it had been, was a thing of the past, and their friendship was solid again. Sky had kept her promise and sent regular updates. Nancy was probably sick of them by now, but Sky simply couldn't help showing off just a little. It wasn't as though they'd met on a questionable dating site or that Karim was a scammer. Nancy had verified his ownership online of Alexandria before grudgingly agreeing that he appeared to be the genuine article. Anyway, Sky would never register on a dating site, despite Nancy's insistence that they were safe if you were cautious and that it was the way everyone hooked up nowadays. She wasn't born yesterday and wouldn't concede all her worldly wealth to a good-looking parasite, even if she had been tempted to dig her toes into that particular shark-infested pond. Besides, her trusty sixth sense had assured her it wouldn't be necessary. She just had to exercise patience, and the man of her dreams would eventually come along and sweep her off her feet. Karim had proven to be that man. So far, everything had been beyond fabulous. Karim was amusing and attentive, a thoughtful and unselfish lover who was accustomed to the best of everything. A nagging little voice at the back of Sky's mind wondered, in that case, why he had settled for her. A man with his looks, charm, intelligence and wealth could have anyone he wanted, and Sky was well aware that she fell far short of perfection. He had left her alone in the hot tub whilst he took a business call. There had been any number of them during the 2-day break. He always apologised profusely, but Sky went out of her way to assure him that she didn't mind. Of course, a man as successful as he clearly was could never be completely off duty. He had actually confessed that he was a bit of a control freak and never entirely trusted anyone else to get the job done, even though he paid his people handsomely and employed only the best and brightest minds. That, Sky assumed, was the key to his success. She heard his footsteps on the boarded deck as he returned to the hot tub, and she hastily hid her phone beneath her towel. She didn't want him to think she was boasting to Nancy, even though she had been. "Hey." Karim flashed the sexy smile that turned Sky's insides to mulch, dropping the towel that he'd draped casually around his waist as he climbed back into the hot tub. Water splashed over its edge as he sat beside her and slipped an arm around her shoulders. "Sorry about that. Sometimes I wonder why I employ so many people when they don't seem to be able to tie their own shoelaces without me holding their hands." He sighed, but Sky knew from what he'd already told her that he wouldn't have it any other way. "Now, where were we? Hey," he added, frowning, "your glass is empty. Can't have that." He reached behind her, extracted a half-full bottle of Krug from the chiller and refilled both of their glasses. He handed hers to her and raised his own in a toast. "To you," he said, smiling into her eyes, "and to my good fortune in having met you. If I had not gone to the club that night, then—" Flustered by the compliment, Sky took a sip of the ruinously expensive champagne, and it slipped smoothly down her throat. A little too smoothly. This was their second bottle, and she had a horrible feeling that she'd drunk a lot more of it than he had. Every time his phone rang, he filled her glass before leaving the tub to answer it. And although Sky had been full of good intentions to sip delicately while she waited for him to come back, she always seemed to drain her glass. Drunk on euphoria, she told herself as bubbles went up her nose, causing her to sneeze somewhat inelegantly. She touched her flute to his, and the ring of crystal on crystal echoed through the night. "I still don't understand what it is that you do," Sky said, wanting to know everything there was to know about this so fascinating entrepreneur, wanting to leave him in no doubt that she was interested. She was still convinced that he must be married or have a significant other waiting patiently for his return in one of his many properties scattered across Europe and beyond. Much as she liked him, she would not be his bit on the side. That was the question she most wanted to ask. Did he have children? And where were Karim's parents, his siblings? Nancy's online sleuthing had revealed that he was a self-made man and philanthropist who'd been born in Alexandria, Egypt, and was 35 years old. There were pictures of him at various swanky charity do's, always with a different woman. He seldom gave interviews and seemed to actively discourage publicity. "I make money and give it away," he said with a self-deprecating shrug. "Why? How?" She turned to face him, frowning. "I don't understand." "Ah, my sweet girl, you think I should keep it all and forget about those less fortunate than me?" No, of course not." Sky's head swam and she felt her cheeks warm. Damn it, she had been so careful not to appear too enthusiastic, to take this weekend in her stride and pretend it was the type of thing she was accustomed to. But the excessive amounts of champagne had loosened her tongue. "That isn't what I mean at all." She reached up to touch his face. "I admire your altruistic character. Really, I do. But you must admit that most wealthy men dedicate themselves to increasing that wealth and jealously guarding what they have amassed." "I, my sweet, am not most men." He stared up at the sky, a faraway look on his face, and she knew he was no longer thinking about her. "Tell me," she said in a softly persuasive tone. "I want to know everything there is to know about you. Especially the stuff you'll never admit to." He was silent for so long that at first she thought he wouldn't answer her. "My parents and siblings were all wiped out in a car bomb attack when I was a child." His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and lacked emotion. "No!" Appalled, Sky abruptly sat up, causing a mini tidal wave to splash over the edge of the tub. "That's terrible." "I was the only survivor. I was just 9 at the time and at school, which saved me." "I hope you weren't the one to find them." "No, my darling. I love your empathy," he added, turning to look at her again and doubtless observing the tears pouring down her face. "Someone came to the school and herded us children together. Mine was not the only family wiped out that day." "I'm so sorry." She leaned the side of her face against his shoulder, conscious of his accelerated heart rate. "How do you get over something like that?" "You don't. It stays with you always. You develop survivor's guilt, which destroys you slowly, if you allow it to." The shoulder that she was using as a pillow stiffened beneath her cheek. "I was alone, lonely, and life seemed pointless. As I grew older, I became more resentful and decided that none of it was my fault. I had the capacity to fight back." He waved a hand. "Not with bombs and bullets, but with my brains. So I made it my mission to help people like me who had been displaced, their lives torn apart for a senseless cause. I started a small importing and exporting business, using grassroots knowledge of my native Egypt to understand what people needed, and it grew from there." "You are remarkable. You make it all sound so easy." "No, my love, there is nothing special about me." He kissed her brow. "I am a survivor, nothing more." "Didn't you feel a burning desire for revenge? I know I would." "Of course. That is why so much of my work is clandestine." "Clandestine? What do you mean?" He smiled at her but said nothing, presumably waiting for her to join the dots. "You work for your government?" she asked. He smiled down at her. I cannot tell you precisely what I do or for whom. Suffice it to say that my efforts bring their own reward. But there is a downside too. I make a lot of enemies. There is a target on my back, which is why I am not married and why I don't have children of my own, much as I would like them. Skye was ashamed at the relief that washed over her at this admission. The man had settled for a lonely existence because he was so deeply scared, and she was selfishly glad that he didn't have a wife waiting in the wings. She was truly a terrible person, it seemed. Karim went on. Those who wish me harm would seize on any such weakness, and I couldn't stand the loss of someone dear to me, not for a second time. Skye nodded her understanding, impressed by his selflessness, his steely determination to avenge his lost family. You are always looking over your shoulder, she said in a voice laced with sympathy. He shrugged. I am well protected. Skye knew that was true. She found the rotation of never less than 4 men patrolling the property a little intrusive, although she understood better now the need for their presence, and for all the high-tech security inside the villa itself. Besides, he added, my business interests and other occupations take me all over the world. As you know from my inability to plan our dates very far in advance, I am never in the same place for long. You own this property? Nothing is in my name. I don't come here often, but meeting you? He looked down at her, and the grip of winter left his eyes, to be replaced with an expression of soft admiration. Meeting you unlocked something inside me, and I wanted to share a few precious days with you. Oh, Karim. Fresh tears swamped her eyes. I feel the same way, but never dreamed that you would want me. So little self-confidence, he said, smiling as he shook his head and tutted. That is one of the things I adore about you. With good reason. I am not Nancy. I barely noticed Nancy. Beautiful women like her abound the world over, but are high maintenance. Yes, she said, nodding because it was true. Nancy did need a lot of attention. I understand. The soft touch of his hand on her forearm prevented Skye from feeling peeved that he hadn't included her in that category. She was glad that he had not, she told herself, especially now that she knew something about the heavy burden he bore on a daily basis. She wanted him to take her seriously, not look upon her as a glamorous plaything in need of constant nurturing. Besides, the truth could never hurt, not really. She wasn't in Nancy's league, had never been high maintenance in her life, and was content simply to have caught the attention of such a charming and charismatic man. How long his interest would last before he grew tired of her, or because she was not his priority, she preferred not to think about. All that mattered was that they were here together, and he was plying her with attention, as well as revealing aspects of his life that she suspected he seldom talked about. That was more than enough to satisfy Skye. She would simply attempt to commit every word, every gesture, every nuance to memory, and if it all fell apart tomorrow, at least she would be able to look back on this blissful moment played out beneath a blanket of stars. In my situation, it would be suicidal to take up with someone like your friend. Before Skye could think of an intelligent response, his phone rang again. He cursed, excused himself, and clambered elegantly from the tub. Skye enjoyed the sight of his tight, naked butt as he walked away from her, phone pressed to his ear. She noticed one of his bodyguards lurking in the shadows, out of earshot, but able to see Skye in all her nakedness if she herself got out of the tub. Not happening, she muttered, resubmerging herself beneath the warm bubbles and sighing with contentment. I am sorry, my darling. Skye had almost dropped off to sleep and started violently at the sound of Karim's voice close to her ear. We will have to cut this trip short, I'm afraid. A small gasp of disappointment slipped past Skye's guard. "That's a shame," she said, trying not to pout. "But we were due to go home tomorrow anyway, and I am grateful for the time that we have spent together."
"You make it sound as though we won't be doing it again."
"Well, after what you just said about commitments, I did think—"
"That I was letting you down gently?"
He smiled and shook his head.
"You don't get away that easily. My men will put you on a flight back to London, but I have to go immediately."
"Oh."
This time she was unable to hide her dismay. The way his men looked at her gave her the creeps.
"I thought you would—"
"Alas, I must go to Egypt. Now, tonight."
He took her hand and helped her from the tub. She forgot about his men lurking nearby, no doubt ogling her, and instead allowed Karim to take her in his arms.
"But I will be back in England within the week, and we will pick up where we left off. I am not about to let another man get anywhere near what's mine. You can count on that."
He kissed her, and Sky's head swirled. Not because of the champagne this time, but because he had sounded so possessive. And because he was determined to see her again, regardless of the danger. That, after all, had been her ultimate goal. Chapter 2. Ryan Callahan sat at the back of the departure lounge. Just like everyone else, he scrolled through his phone, giving the appearance of being totally engrossed. Unlike everyone else, though, he kept Skylar Kennedy in his sights. She looked distracted. Perhaps she'd been crying. It was hard to tell given that she was wearing shades that covered half her face. She kept her gaze focused on the phone in her hands, as though willing it to ring, and never once turned in his direction. Business class passengers were invited to board, and Sky got up with the privileged view to make her way to the gate. She didn't push herself forward with the passengers who moved with purpose and authority. She looked unsure of herself, as though she expected to be turned back at any moment or have her right to board with the elite challenged. This woman was unaccustomed to travelling in style, it would appear, which made Ryan highly suspicious about Amin's interest in her. She was most definitely not Amin's usual type. Could Ryan somehow exploit the fact that she'd gotten herself in above her head, even if she didn't yet realise it? Amin must have a reason for involving himself with this latest conquest. He didn't ordinarily take his women abroad with him, so he obviously had a particular interest in this one, and Ryan doubted whether that interest was purely amatory. Amin used people the way that most men used credit cards. Ryan waited until his row at the front of economy was called and smiled at Sky as he passed her aisle seat at the rear of the business cabin. She was still wearing her dark glasses, and it was impossible for Ryan to judge if she was even looking his way. Something or someone had clearly upset her, and it didn't take the brain of a rocket scientist to figure out who that someone had to be. With an aisle seat himself just behind Sky, but on the opposite side of the aisle and with the curtains that divided business from the oi polloi pulled back pending takeoff, Ryan still had her clearly in his sights. The guy beside her in the window seat tried to engage her in conversation, but Sky appeared to answer him in monosyllables. When that failed to deter him, she snatched the safety card from the seat pocket in front of her and studied it intently, not appearing to notice that she was holding it upside down. The flight was bumpy, but uneventful. When they landed, Ryan loitered, letting everyone else disembark before him. As he left the plane, he smiled at the flight attendant, who had been flirting with him for the entire journey, and sauntered through the terminal to passport control. Once clear, he made his way to the baggage hall, standing well back from the carousel where the luggage from their flight were being delivered. Ryan didn't have a bag himself, but watched as Sky struggled to grab hers from the conveyor. A guy helped her with it. She thanked him and wheeled her case through the green channel. Ryan followed. He knew her name and absolutely nothing else about her, except for the fact that she'd spent the weekend with Karim Amin,
A weekend that had been cut short, presumably because Amin had received a better offer. Perhaps that was what had upset Skye so badly. Women of all ages appeared to fall for the bastard, swallowing his lies without seeming to question them. Ryan hoped Skye was not that gullible. The turn his thoughts had taken brought him up short as he followed her into the train station. He had a job to do. Skye had unexpectedly fallen into his lap and was a means to an end. You couldn't make an omelette without cracking a few eggs. Besides, when she found out what really made Amin tick, she'd thank Ryan for saving her hide. She was clearly waiting for the London train, and Ryan took up a position a little further down the platform. He very much doubted whether she would recognise him from the plane, but it wouldn't do to blow it now by getting too close. First of all, he needed to find out where she lived, and with whom. Ryan was curious about her, partly because she wasn't the statuesque model type that Amin usually went for. This one was shy, self-effacing, and unused to the glamorous life, as evidenced by her choice of transportation. Ryan had assumed she would head for the taxi rank, and was pleasantly surprised when she didn't, making it that much easier to follow her. The tracker he had surreptitiously attached to the underside of her case when she moved away from the carousel and pushed her way through the crowds would probably not be called into play. He was going off the grid on this one, he knew, as he boarded the train at the opposite end of the carriage to the one she occupied. Once again she took an aisle seat, making it easier for Ryan to keep her in his sights. She sat there, staring into space, not reaching for reading material. She had her phone in her hand and checked it constantly. Ryan was willing to bet that she was hoping for a message from Amin. She left the train at Clapham Junction, grateful for the crowds in the cosmopolitan suburb. Ryan was able to follow pretty close without much possibility of her noticing him. She paused outside a terraced house, divided into flats a few streets back from Clapham Common, and rummaged in her handbag. Producing a set of keys, she opened the door, dragged her case in behind her, and slammed the door shut again. Ryan leapt onto the porch and peered through the frosted glass, just about able to make her out dragging her bag up the stairs. He glanced at the doorbells, 2 to each floor. He knew she didn't live on the ground floor, so he had a 1 in 4 chance of guessing right. Standing back, he watched the upper floors for signs of sudden activity. It was a dull afternoon, and anyone arriving home would naturally snap a light on. Nothing moved. Shit. There were no names on the bells. People had stopped advertising who they were in that way, even if they were prepared to plaster the most intimate details of their private lives all over social media for fear of drawing unwanted attention to themselves. The irony was not lost on Ryan. Aware that he would be able to discover the names of the occupants easily enough, Ryan was on the point of leaving when a figure appeared in the first-floor window, hugging a white cat close to her body and staring directly down at him. It was Skye. She had removed her shades, and Ryan was too far away to make out her features. There was no mistaking the waterfall of dark hair that hung over one shoulder in a thick riot of curls, though. He could see her shoulders shaking and sensed that she must be crying. "Don't cry for that arsehole," Ryan muttered. "He ain't worth it." He was sorely tempted to ring her bell and try to... To what, precisely? He wasn't authorised to involve anyone else in a highly sensitive operation. Hell, he wasn't even supposed to be keeping tabs on Amin. That duty fell to others. But Ryan's reason was highly personal, and he'd done it on his own time. Since he'd been in the south of France anyway, he'd stopped by the place Amin used in St Tropez on a whim, having bumped into him, almost literally, in the market, his arm draped around Skye, oblivious to Ryan's presence. 2 ostentatious heavies trailing behind him. They weren't especially vigilant, since neither of them had noticed Ryan.
Something was definitely off about Amin's behaviour, and it could just be the opportunity that Ryan and his colleagues had been waiting for. So he'd followed Skye to the airport, discovering her name when he heard her give it to the woman on the British Airways desk, claiming that a ticket had been left for her. That implied to Ryan that she was returning to London unexpectedly because Amin had received a call to arms. So Ryan had purchased a ticket for himself on the same flight, and here he was. Skye was still at her window, absently stroking the cat and staring out. But Ryan was no longer convinced that she was looking at him. She was away with the fairies, most likely, completely taken in by Amin's seduction technique. The spell was broken when another woman stepped up to Skye and gave her a hug. The cat got squashed between them and extricated itself with an indignant swish of its tail. That decided it as far as Ryan was concerned. Ringing Skye's bell had always been a risk. She was bound to run to Amin with tales of Ryan's accusations. Even so, his habitual common sense and professionalism had flown out the window at the sight of Skye's shaking shoulders, and if it wasn't for the presence of the other woman, he might well have followed his instincts and tried to talk to her. "Another time," he said aloud, as he scrolled through his contacts and dialed a number. "Come on then, give." Nancy released Skye from a fierce hug. Perdita took exception to being squashed between them, gave an indignant howl, and leapt from Skye's arms as Nancy stood back to examine Skye's face, ignoring the cat that now wound herself around Nancy's legs, hoping no doubt to be fed. Nancy scowled at whatever she read from Skye's expression, an expression that Skye couldn't seem to moderate. Not that she needed to, not with Nancy. They had few secrets from one another. Only one massive one, as it happened, and Skye had perfected the art of protecting it. "What did the bastard do to you? Why are you back early? Why have you been crying? If he's hurt you, I'm going to kill him slowly and painfully." "No, he didn't hurt me, Nancy." Skye shook her head. "Quite the opposite. We had a whale of a time, beyond my wildest imaginings. Everything was, well, perfect, 5-star. Nothing was too much trouble for him. I felt truly cherished." "Well then, why the long face? What are you looking at, come to that?" Nancy asked. Skye stared intently out of the window, squinting at the figure standing across the street, staring directly up at her. "That man over there, the one on his phone looking up at us, I'm absolutely sure he was on the same flight as me." "Impossible," Nancy laughed. "You've clearly had too much sex and not nearly enough sleep. You're imagining things." Perhaps. But Skye didn't think so. Karim had warned her about the possibility of being followed. She remembered what he had said about forming close and lasting friendships for fear of those friends being used to get to him. Skye was motivated to prove that she was loyal and trustworthy and that no one would ever manipulate her into giving up Karim's secrets. Not that she knew anything much, not yet, at least, but that was beside the point. And no matter what Nancy said, no matter how far away she was from the guy in the street, she was absolutely sure that she had seen him on the flight home. He was hard to overlook. The man walked away, phone pressed to his ear, and Skye turned to face Nancy, a smile breaking through her unease. "Come on then, girl, give." Nancy clapped her hands. "I want all the gory details, and don't you dare leave anything out." They sat on the sofa. Nancy had already cracked open a bottle of wine, and Skye did it justice as she talked non-stop about the wonders of St Tropez in general, and Karim in particular. "You're glowing, lit up from the inside," Nancy said, squeezing Skye's hand. "I'm glad. You're long overdue a little fun after all you've been through. But tell me, if it was all so wonderful, what are you doing home again a day early?" Skye screwed up her features. He got an emergency call and had to scurry back to Egypt. Nancy frowned. It couldn't wait another day until your weekend was done? He's driven, a self-confessed control freak. That's what makes him so successful. Skye giggled. He's very hands-on. Nancy grinned, but the gesture lacked humour and smacked of suspicion. I'll bet he is. Just be careful, darling. I don't want to see you get hurt. Can't you just be happy for me? Skye asked. You know I am. Nancy topped up their glasses. I realise this isn't Krug and you're not drinking in a hot tub with a hunk. Instead, it's supermarket plonk and you're here with me when you'd much prefer to be elsewhere. But still, you know what they say? Better to be a has-been than a never was. Cheers! Nancy raised her glass and clinked it against Skye's. It made a dull thunk, 1,000,000 times removed from the high-pitched ringing sound produced by Karim's crystal. When did Skye come to be so judgmental about inconsequential stuff, or to care about it at all, for that matter? Part of her wondered if she was changing her perceptions in order to fit into Karim's world. She hoped she wasn't that shallow. Skye was her own woman and wasn't about to change for anyone. Not even Karim. Skye declined Nancy's offer of food, claiming to have eaten on the plane, which was untrue, and almost the first time she hadn't been completely honest with her oldest friend. The truth was that Skye had barely touched a morsel since leaving Karim. She was too wound up to eat, and the wine she'd just drunk was threatening to give her indigestion. She cried off from accompanying Nancy to some club or other, wondering how her friend could even imagine that she'd put herself out there when she was in a relationship with every girl's wildest fantasy. Instead, she took a long shower and went to bed early, even though she knew she wouldn't sleep. She tried not to check her phone every 2 minutes, hoping for a message from Karim. He had promised a text when he landed, but had warned her that it might not be possible. He had more important things to do, she knew. But her insecurities had surfaced the moment he'd kissed her goodbye, and despite all his promises, she now worried that he had forgotten all about her. "Where are you?" she cried impatiently. No call came, and Skye eventually fell asleep, feeling bereft. And hungry. Common sense told her that she wasn't Karim's priority, but her heart was having none of it. How long did it take to bang out a one-line text, she wondered? Images of him dead or dying in a ditch flooded her mind. God, she was a mess. She drifted into the kitchen after 10 o'clock the following morning, having not slept all night, or so it had felt. She'd actually fallen into a heavy sleep as dawn seeped round the gap in her bedroom curtains. Fortunately, she worked from home and set her own hours. Then she remembered it was Sunday. "You should have given me a shout," Skye said, yawning behind her hand and simultaneously tucking a tangled strand of hair behind her ear. "I did try, but you were dead to the world." Nancy looked up from her computer. A graphic designer in great demand, Nancy's decision to go self-employed was starting to pay off, and Skye was delighted that her friend's talent was now getting the recognition it deserved. "Thought you might have wanted to go for a run with me." "You've been out already and are now working? On a Sunday?" Skye raised a brow. "I'm impressed, especially since you probably didn't get in until the early hours." "No such thing as the Sunday off when you work for yourself. And I was home and tucked up in bed all alone by midnight." "Goodness. Are you feeling quite well?" Nancy laughed. "You can have too much of a good thing. All the straight single guys are so boring." Skye nodded, thinking of Karim as she poured water into the coffee machine, filled the coffee filter, placed a cup under the spout, and pressed the button to set the machine whirling. "You look terrible," Nancy said, concern etched in her features when Skye sat at the table across from her, blowing impatiently on her coffee so that she could have a much-needed infusion of Java. "Yeah, well, What is it? Nancy cocked her head to one side as she examined Skye. You've not heard from him, I take it? Skye shook her head, trying to behave casually, aware that her friend knew her too well to be deceived by the display, but was kind enough to pretend. I can't help worrying, she said lamely, telling herself that Karim would definitely be in touch. He was simply playing a waiting game, hoping to make her nervous. Well, he was succeeding. Why? He's the big boy and has a lot of commitments. You said so yourself last night. Several times, if memory serves. Nancy rested her chin on her hand. You're worried, I suppose, that he has another woman waiting in the wings? Well, wouldn't you be? I mean, you've seen what he looks like and the standard of living he takes for granted. Skye glanced down at her tatty robe. She hadn't even showered or brushed her hair, and was instead wallowing in self-pity. He can do a ton better than me. She tried a smile on for size. But still, at least I had a fabulous weekend. Well, almost a complete weekend. That I will never forget. You're selling yourself short, Skye. Nancy expelled a long-suffering sigh. How many more times do I have to tell you? Easy for you to say. You have self-confidence, a lovely face and a killer body. I don't. What did Karim tell you about himself? Come on, give. Nancy leaned forward. You must know more about him now than you did before you went away. Or were you so busy screwing one another's brains out that there was no time for talk? Her eyes glistened with amusement. In which case, I'll forgive you. I mean, priorities and all that. His entire family were wiped out by a car bomb. Skye dashed a tear aside. Can you imagine anything worse? In Egypt? Yes. Skye blinked. I assume so. I didn't actually ask. I didn't think suicide bombings was such a big thing in Egypt. Good point. He was deeply emotional when he told me about it, that's all I know. I don't think he talks about it much. Skye yawned behind her hand. Anyway, I think he's still suffering from survivor's guilt. I know I would be, which explains why he does so much good with his money. What good does he do? Nancy asked, a sceptical edge to her voice. He gives a lot to charity. Skye sounded deliberately vague, aware that she'd already said more than she should have. Karim trusted her, and she had too much invested in their fledgling relationship to blow it by betraying that trust, even though she knew she could depend upon Nancy's discretion. So do most men in his position. Nancy shrugged. It's tax deductible. Don't be so cynical. Nancy chuckled. He's a businessman, darling. He will think that way, and if he doesn't, you could be sure that his accountants will point him in the appropriate direction. Making donations is a good look for men in his position. If they shout about it, Skye shot back, wondering why Nancy was being so negative. Karim doesn't. Well, we know that, don't we? There was suspiciously little to be found about him online. Skye hated that she was unable to put Nancy straight about such a principled man's, principles. Karim was haunted by his demons and would likely never know inner peace ever again. Join the club. She still recalled his distant, desolate expression when he talked about his dead family. Whatever else he might be into, he couldn't fake that sort of emotional turmoil. He likes to keep a low profile and let his actions talk for him. Okay. Really, Nancy, why are you so suspicious? Just because he's good-looking and it was me he went for? Skye, I'm happy for you. Really, I am. But I still can't understand what could be so urgent that it couldn't have waited another day until your weekend was over and done with. Skye knew it wasn't that simple, but wasn't about to say. She was happy with the progress she'd made with Karim, and that was all that mattered. Her phone beeped with an incoming message at that precise moment, and Skye pounced on it like a parched woman reaching for water. Nancy chuckled, but not unkindly.
"Atta girl," she said. "Play it cool."
"It's him."
"Hi, all well, back to UK in 2 days. Miss you already, kiss kiss."
"Well," Nancy's eyes gleamed with curiosity. "Still in one piece, I take it?" Sky bit her lower lip to stop herself from crying with relief. "He'll be back in a couple of days." "Good. I take it he'll be whining and dining you in the manner you deserve?" "I expect so," Sky replied vaguely, conscious of the fact that Karim hadn't asked her to keep the time free for him. But he'd contacted her, hadn't he, when he had other, more pressing priorities? Sky suddenly felt capable of conquering the world. Nancy had returned her attention to her computer screen, but she was scowling, and Sky could sense her biting back the remarks she wanted to make. Sky simply didn't care. Karim was coming back to London. He was still alive and still thinking about her. She was back on track. She got up from her place at the table and danced across the kitchen, deciding to skip breakfast. She'd put on a few pounds and didn't want Karim to think she didn't care about her appearance. "I'm going for a power walk around the common," she told Nancy. "Then a long hot soak in the bath and general pampering will be in order." Nancy smiled and waved her off. Engrossed with whatever she was doing online, she didn't even look up. Chapter 3. Sunday afternoon, and Karim luxuriated in the St Tropez hot tub, a curvy blonde's head nestled against his shoulder as his hands lazily explored the curves in question. Poor little Sky, he thought, chuckling. She'd read his deliberately delayed message the moment he sent it. She'd probably had her phone in her hand the entire time, wondering where he was, who he was with, waiting for him to get in touch. She was well and truly hooked. All he had to do was reel her in. He had always believed that the moment he separated her from her streetwise, overly suspicious friend, she would be ripe for exploitation. Even so, he still needed to play her carefully, the carrot and stick approach. He had almost passed her over when he realised just how closely her friend protected her. There were plenty of other targets, and he didn't need that sort of aggravation or attention. He intended to run Sky for his own purposes, and so it wasn't only her friend that he needed to take into consideration.